Before this goes any further, understand one thing. What happened to Ranger Rodger Sampson in the Appalachian Mountains has never been explained. And to this day, nobody knows what happened to her husband. Not the search teams, not the state police, not Sampson himself 3 years after the file went cold on his own desk. In the last week of February, on a stretch of national forest land off Wolf Creek Road in the Blue Ridge backcountry, Sampson took a call that should have closed out in 40 minutes. A married couple. A weekend campsite 2 miles past the fire road. A husband on the phone, begging someone to come check on his own wife. By the time Sampson made it back out of those woods, the husband was gone without a trace. The wife was sitting exactly where he'd left her 3 hours earlier, and the campfire between them hadn't burned down by so much as an inch, in a fire that had no business still being alive. This is what happened to him. "23 years on the Parkway had taught Sampson to judge a call by the sound underneath the words, not the words themselves. Lost hikers apologized before they finished a sentence. Drunk campers laughed at their own fear halfway through reporting it. This one did neither. Badge 114, 37 years old, driving a decommissioned F-150 with a heater vent that had quit blowing warm air on the driver's side 2 winters back, a detail he'd end up repeating to the state police 3 separate times, because the cold was the first thing he remembered clearly about that night. 11:42 p.m., the last week of February. Dispatch clocked the outside temperature at 24 degrees and dropping fast enough that Sampson grabbed his heavier coat off the hook without thinking twice about it. The voice on the line was male, shaking in the specific way of a man losing a fight to stay calm. "Please, you have to send someone. My wife, something's wrong with Sandy. We're at the campsite off Wolf Creek Road, 2 miles past the fire road. Please, just come." The line went dead before dispatch could get a last name. There was a second call attempted right after. Dispatch logged it, 4 seconds long, no words, just breathing, and then nothing. Nobody flagged it as important at the time. Sampson radioed it in and drove out himself. 40 minutes, most of it on gravel, headlights catching nothing but bare trees and mile markers ticking past in the dark. The campsite was small. 2 lawn chairs, a dome tent zipped shut, a fire burning low and orange against the black tree line. The kind of setup that belonged to people who'd done this a dozen times before, not first-timers. It was also a fire that should have needed 2 more logs in the 11 minutes since that call disconnected, and there wasn't a split log stacked anywhere at that site. Sampson clocked that detail and filed it away, not yet knowing it was the first of several things that night that wouldn't add up, no matter how many times he ran the math. A woman sat in one of the chairs, hands folded in her lap like she was waiting on a bus. The other chair was empty. He'd spend the next 3 hours trying to figure out what, or who, was supposed to be sitting in it, and whether the answer to that question was still out there somewhere, close enough to hear him coming. Sampson approached slow, boots crunching gravel loud enough that he wished he'd walked on the grass instead. Wood smoke hit him first, and under it something sweeter, colder. A smell that didn't belong anywhere near a campfire. She wore a cardigan buttoned wrong by 1 hole, a wedding band turned sideways on her finger, and a thin smear of ash along her jaw like she'd wiped at something that wasn't there. Ordinary. Almost. "Ma'am, Ranger Sampson, we got a call from your husband. He said you needed help." She turned her head toward him. Not fast, not slow, deliberate, the way a person moves underwater. Her face gave him nothing, not fear, not confusion, nothing at all. "No," she said, "I'm fine." Flat, no inflection, a line read off a card she'd memorized, but never bothered to understand. Sampson asked where her husband was. She looked back into the fire. "Joseph." "Yes, ma'am. Joseph. Where is he?" "My husband is with her." No hesitation in it, no question mark waiting at the end. A fact, delivered the same flat way a person might mention the sky was dark out. "Who's her?" She looked at him directly then for the first time since he'd walked up. Her mouth moved, not quite a smile, something adjacent to one. "You know," she said. "Everyone knows her." She never gave a name that night, and Sampson would spend 3 years not asking anyone else if they knew it either, because some part of him was already certain that hearing it out loud would only confirm what he didn't want confirmed. She tilted her head, slow, the same underwater motion. "Would you like some jelly beans?" Sampson didn't answer. He'd get that same question 6 more times before the night was through. 2 things were true. Now that had no business being true at the same time. A husband who'd called for help 20 minutes ago was nowhere on that site. And his wife sat by a fire that hadn't dropped an inch, offering candy like she was hosting somebody's birthday. He crouched near her chair, keeping his voice level, the way he'd been trained to talk to people who weren't tracking right. "Sandy, is that your name? Sandy, can you tell me what your husband looks like?" Something shifted behind her eyes then, a flicker, gone before he could name it. 6 feet. Dark hair, red flannel. He wears it because I bought it for him. The tense change caught in Sampson's chest before his brain even flagged it. Wears, not wore. And he'd go back and forth for years on whether that word meant something or nothing at all. "Okay, Sandy, I need you to come with me. We're going to go find him." She stood without protest, without a single question, the way someone stands up when they've been waiting all night for those exact words and no others. Sampson clicked his flashlight on and swept it toward the tree line, toward the narrow gap in the brush that had to be the trail continuing on. The beam caught something at the edge of the clearing he hadn't noticed walking in. A second folding chair, collapsed and leaned against a tree 10 feet outside the firelight, set facing the woods instead of the fire. Nobody sits a chair facing away from warmth on a 24-degree night. Not unless they were watching for something to come out of those trees, or waiting for something to leave. He didn't mention it to Sandy. He filed it the same way he'd filed the fire and the ash and the wrong tense. Another loose thread in a night that already had too many. One he fully intended to pull the second he had backup standing beside him, instead of a woman who smiled at nothing and asked about candy. She fell into step beside him without being told, matching his pace exactly, close enough that he could hear her breathing over his own boots in the leaves. And that was the detail that finally put a knot in his stomach he wouldn't shake for the rest of the night. Sandy walked ahead of him now, uninvited, choosing the trail like she'd already known which way to go. Sampson let her lead. It wasn't procedure. It was the fastest way to keep her in front of him instead of behind. They passed the trailhead kiosk 4 minutes in. His light caught the sign-in log bolted under glass, and he almost kept walking until the handwriting stopped him. Last entry, dated 2 days back, the letters getting sloppier line by line like whoever wrote it had been rushing to finish. Campsite off Wolf Creek. Do not let her count past 3. She's not asking about candy. No name signed under it. Sampson photographed it on his phone and kept moving, telling himself it was a prank left by bored thru-hikers with too much time between shelters. He almost believed it. Sandy hadn't asked about candy since the campsite. That was the detail he wouldn't clock until he read his own report back 3 years later. She'd stopped the second they passed that kiosk, like she already knew what the glass was hiding. The fog rolled in low and fast somewhere past the half-mile marker, pooling into the hollow the way water pools into a low spot in a driveway. Not gradual, just suddenly there, all at once. 10 feet was the entire visible world. Every tree past that line turned into a suggestion instead of a shape. Flashlights sweeping, boots in wet leaf litter. Joseph's name, called twice, then a third time, swallowed whole before it made it past the first row of trunks. Nothing answered. Sampson checked his phone. 1 bar, flickering. He could call it in right now, wait for backup, stand at the kiosk until somebody else showed up to split the risk with him. He kept walking instead. Stopping meant losing sight of a woman who'd already made a grown man disappear from a campsite in under an hour, and letting her out of arm's reach was a mistake he couldn't afford twice. Every few minutes, without prompting, Sandy murmured something under her breath that Sampson couldn't quite catch. 3 syllables, repeated, like counting. Rain started, cold and steady, thickening the fog instead of clearing it. His jacket soaked through at the shoulders inside of 5 minutes. Sandy walked through it dry, or close enough to dry that he'd swear to it later and nobody would believe him. Then the trees opened into a small clearing, and on the ground inside it sat a red flannel shirt, folded, not dropped, not snagged on a branch, folded into a neat square and set down like someone had taken the time to do it right in the middle of a state of emergency. Sampson crouched to pick it up, rain running off the brim of his hat and down the back of his collar. "Sandy, is this Jose?" He turned around to ask her. 10 feet of empty clearing looked back at him. No footprints leading away in any direction he could find with the flashlight, no broken brush, no sound of movement in a forest wet enough that a single footstep should have carried like a gunshot. She was gone. Not stepped back into the fog. Not slipped behind a tree while his back was turned. Gone, the way a word disappears the moment you stop trying to remember it. There, and then simply not, with nothing in between. Sampson stood there holding a folded shirt that belonged to a man who no longer seemed to exist, in a clearing that had just proven a full-grown woman could vanish from 10 feet away without making a sound. For the first time all night, he understood exactly how far past backup he'd let himself walk. The flashlight beam shook once in his hand before he steadied it. Somewhere behind him, past the edge of what the light could reach, something shifted in the wet brush, once, and only once, like it had been waiting for him to notice the shirt before it dared to move at all. The fog had erased every landmark Sampson had used to find his way in. Every trunk looked like the last one. The rain kept coming, harder now, needling through gaps in the canopy. 20 minutes of calling her name, then Joseph's, then both together, swallowed whole each time by trees that gave nothing back. Then Sampson noticed it. His own footsteps landed in a rhythm he knew by feel after 23 years on this mountain. But when he stopped to get his bearings, one more step landed after his. Quiet, unmistakable. 15 feet back, maybe less, where the brush grew thick enough to hide a man standing still. He spun the flashlight around. Trees, rain, nothing that his light could catch and hold. He picked up his pace, not running yet, and the step behind him picked up too, not gaining, not falling back, matching him exactly, landing a half-second late every time he stopped to test it. Sampson ran. Branches tore at his forearms, wet bark scraping skin raw through his jacket sleeve. His own breath ran ragged, coppery at the back of his throat, each pull of air thinner than the last. Roots caught his boot twice, and both times he stayed upright out of pure refusal to go down out here, alone, in a forest that had already proven it could make grown people disappear. The smell hit him again, closer now than it had any right to be, sweeter than wood smoke, cold in a way that had nothing to do with February. It wasn't behind him anymore, so much as it was simply there, all around, the way a room fills with cold air the second a door opens somewhere you can't see. An orange glow bled through the trees ahead. Sampson broke into the campsite gasping, boots skidding on wet leaves, and for 1 second the relief nearly buckled his knees, right up until his eyes finished adjusting and told him what he was actually looking at. The fire was exactly as tall as it had been 3 hours earlier, not a coal lower, not a single log added, and none needed, burning steady and orange in rain that should have drowned it an hour ago. Sandy sat in the same chair, dry, completely dry, despite the storm that had soaked through Sampson to the skin, her cardigan and her hair and the wrongly buttoned collarbone dry like the rain simply chose not to touch her. She turned her head, the same slow underwater turn from the start of the night. "Would you like some jelly beans?" 7th time. He'd counted every one without meaning to, delivered in the same flat cadence, the same 4 minutes and some change apart, timed like a metronome nobody had asked to be wound. Sampson's hand found the radio at his shoulder, thumb already on the switch, and that was when he saw it properly, the thing he'd been catching only in pieces all night. It stood at the tree line behind Sandy's chair, close enough now that the firelight finally reached it. It wore the shape of a man in a red flannel shirt. That was the first lie the eyes told, because the shirt hung wrong, draped over something with roughly a man's height and proportions the way a scarecrow has roughly a man's proportions, close enough to register, wrong enough to make the stomach drop before the brain finished the math. The face beneath the collar wasn't a face so much as a suggestion of one, features smeared toward each other like wet paint dragged sideways. The mouth hanging open on a hinge no jaw was built to allow. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It had been standing there the whole time Sampson was running, patient in a way nothing patient should ever be, waiting at the one place it already knew he'd come back to. Sandy's head was still turned toward Sampson, waiting on her answer, jelly beans held out in an open palm that had never once shaken all night. "Sandy," Sampson said, and his voice came out smaller than he wanted it to. "Sandy, look at me. Don't turn around." She smiled then, the first real smile of the night, no longer borrowed, no longer adjacent to anything. It reached her eyes in a way nothing else about her had all evening, and that was somehow the worst part. "He already did," she said. Behind her, the thing in the red flannel shirt tilted its head to match hers. Exactly, the same slow underwater angle. The fire didn't so much as flicker. Somewhere in the trees beyond it, past the reach of the light, Sampson thought he heard a second fire catching. Small, and getting closer. Sampson didn't ask anything else. He got Sandy on her feet, kept his body angled between her and the tree line, and walked her out the way they'd come. Flashlight steady now, radio finally keyed, backup rolling before he'd made it half a mile toward the truck. A full search went out at first light. K-9 units, drones, 40 volunteers on grid patterns for 3 straight days. They recovered exactly one item, the red flannel shirt, still folded in the bed of Sampson's truck where he'd left it. No body, no trail, no sign a man named Joseph had ever existed past a marriage license and a missing persons file with his name typed at the top. Sandy gave one statement at the hospital that night, and then answered every question after that the same way. Flat, hollow, occasionally asking deputies if they wanted jelly beans. Doctors held her 72 hours on nothing and had to let her go. No evidence, no struggle, no name for her, whoever her was supposed to be. The site off Wolf Creek Road has been reserved under a different name every year since, always the same last week of February. Always paid in cash at the self-pay station, always empty by the time anyone drives out to check. Joseph's file is still open. Cold case, active, Sampson's name still attached to the report 3 years later, even after he turned his badge in. He retired not long after, not officially because of that night, though everyone at the station understood otherwise. Nobody pushed him on the reason. Some of them had heard just enough of the story secondhand to know they didn't want the details filled in. He still thinks about the way she said everyone knows her. About a fire that never once dropped an inch through hours of rain. About a woman who vanished from 10 feet away in a silent forest and was waiting for him, dry. Back at a campsite he never should have found his way back to. And sometimes, when he can't sleep, he thinks about the jelly beans. He never did answer her that night. He tells himself that's the reason he made it out at all. That whatever was standing behind that chair was waiting on one specific word, and he never gave it the chance to hear it. Some nights he's not sure that's actually true. Last February, a hiker called it in from a pullout near Wolf Creek Road. Said there was a campfire burning out past the tree line at 2 in the morning, small and orange and steady, despite the cold snap that had frozen the creek solid 2 nights running. Dispatch sent a unit out to check. They found the site empty. 2 folding chairs, both facing the fire. No ash cold enough to explain how long it had actually been burning, and no sign anybody had been there at all. Except for a scattering of jelly beans, untouched, sitting in the dirt beside the near chair like somebody had set them down and simply forgotten to come back for them. Nobody at the station mentioned it to Sampson. They didn't think he needed to know the site was still active. But if you ask around Wolf Creek Road today, some of the old-timers will tell you the same thing they told him 3 years ago, back when he still had a badge, and a reason to believe there was a rational answer waiting at the end of it. Some things in these mountains aren't looking for a person to find. They're looking for someone to ask.